Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. I last spoke here 2 years ago, I think, and there's always a wonderful atmosphere and energy here. I'm going to be talking on, the reason I'm showing these two books is the subject that I'm going to be talking about, the factual basis of it is in my book Supernatural, and if you want more factual detail on some of the things I'm going to say, it'll be in there. I've also just published my first novel after years of writing non-fiction, and that's Entangled, and it also concerns parallel realms and altered states of consciousness, so that's why I'm putting them both up there. When we talk about crop circles, and this talk is not about crop circles, but when we talk about them, I've noticed that a lot of people are interested in exploring the possibility that aliens or extraterrestrials may be involved in the making of these crop circles. I'd prefer not to jump immediately to that conclusion, but my own sense is that we are dealing with something from the beyond when we deal with crop circles. Some sort of communication from the beyond, not from this daily realm of life. And I think the question of what that beyond is remains to be settled. It might be aliens in the nuts and bolts sense, crossing interstellar space in incredible spaceships to get here, or it might be something even more mysterious than that, but certainly something not of this not of this realm. Now, we're very close to the great African apes. In fact, that's what we are. We're just another great African ape, and the DNA difference between us and them is extremely small. And yet there obviously is a huge difference, and we assume that if there is an interest in this world from the beyond, it's somehow an interest in us. When we look at the human story and we trace the evolution of humanity, we find that the focus to a large extent is on changes in physical appearance, that we were stooped and sort of knuckle dragging, and we became more upright, our appearance became more and more modern, our brow ridges receded, we became taller. The talk tends to be about these physical changes that take place over the evolutionary story of mankind. What's also interesting and talked about a lot is the question of tools. Our ancestors didn't make any tools at all until 2.5 million years ago. They weren't anatomically modern humans then. They didn't look like you and I. But they started making the first tools about 2.5 million years ago. And that tool type, which is called the Oldowan stone tool tradition, actually continued without change for the best part of 1 million years. That's an incredibly long time if you think that the whole story of human civilization is 5,000 years long. 1 million years they stuck with the same stone tools. And then there was a change. These are also Oldowan. Then there was a change, and the Acheulean stone tool tradition came in. And that goes from about 1.5 million years ago right down to 250,000 years ago, getting pretty recent. So that tells us that a tradition was being passed down, but it also tells us that our ancestors at that time were incredibly rigid and had become fixed in a particular framework and just kept churning out the same sort of artifacts again and again and again and again and again for hundreds of thousands of years. And so if you look at the story of human evolution, it's roughly 6 million year story from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee up to us today, and quite frankly, it's 6 million years of almost total boredom. Nothing really happens. They just make these incredibly dull tools, and they keep on making them. And they slowly start to look more and more like us. The first sign that something extraordinary is beginning to happen comes in around about 100,000 years ago, 100 to 125,000 years ago, where we start seeing definite evidence that our ancestors are making some kind of personal ornaments. Shell beads, shells that are drilled in a certain way, definitely were hung in necklaces. It's a symbolism. It's the first sign of symbolism. Then if you go to Blombos Cave in South Africa, you'll find the first real graphic art. This is the first thing that you can really call art, where these geometric patterns have been incised into the side of a small block of stone. But if you jump forward to 50,000 years ago or less, and particularly the period between 40 and 30,000 years ago, it's as though a light has been switched on in the human brain all around the world. Something incredible has happened. We are, by this stage, of course, dealing with fully anatomically modern human beings. But we had been dealing with fully anatomically modern human beings for 200,000 years before that. But they weren't doing this stuff. They weren't creating this extraordinary art. And it's really a great mystery where the inspiration for cave art came from and where the ability to create that art was developed. It seems to switch on really quite suddenly. Now, I've been lucky enough to visit about 20 of the great painted caves in southern Europe. And these places are cathedrals, cathedrals of the spirit. You enter an underground realm and find yourself surrounded by the most incredible expression of human spirituality. It's not just the paintings on the walls. Everything conspires to draw you into this underworld and to speak to you of realities beyond our own. One of the great myths is that the cave artists were simply painting animals that they hunted. Not so. There's no correlation at all between the animals that were hunted around particular caves and the animals that are painted there. And often, if you get close to some of these paintings, you find that the animals are very strange, like this deer here with these extraordinary antlers, which you do not find in everyday life. And often they have curious little geometrical patterns in the design as well. Like, for example, here in Lascaux, two beautiful running horses, an incredible work of art. But what's this little grid doing up here as part of the image? And here, it's like the cow jumped over the moon, and there's the grid again. What is that? What was that for? Nobody really seemed to know until quite recently. Flows and patterns of dots around the animals in the imagery. And hands everywhere. One of the things that I found most eerie about the painted caves, when you go into them, is these handprints that are on the walls. Now, they were often created by placing the hand against the wall and then actually blowing paint, spitting it over the hand and leaving a negative imprint. But as you go in and look at these hands, you don't feel that you're looking at a painting of a hand. You feel that there's a hand on the other side of the wall, which is pushing through the wall towards you. A sense that the cave wall is a membrane between one state of reality and another. And this becomes very powerful, particularly if you can get into the caves alone, without any of the surrounding noise or hubbub. The sense of contact with another realm is very, very strong. This is Pechmerle Cave in the south of France, and we see here these two horses framed between stalactites. And as you get closer, you can see that although you can see why this piece of rock was chosen to paint a horse on, because it has a naturally horse-headed spur of rock at the end. But if you look at the horses themselves, there's something slightly odd about them. The heads are very, very tiny. The dots, the dapples on the horses' bodies extend beyond the bodies of the horses, which of course doesn't happen in daily life. And here we have a hand with 6 fingers. So the first sense you get is that you're looking at a depiction of daily life, and as you look closer, you find that there's something odd or off-key about it a little bit. The oldest works of art to have come down to us from the Stone Age all depict the same kind of being. And that being is called technically a therianthrope. That's from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man, beast men, part animal, part human. This is from Fumani Cave in Italy, and it's a horned figure, the head of an auroch, and the body of a human being. If we go to Chauvet Cave in France, we find again a bison man. The hips are human, the legs are human, but as you come up to the shoulder and the head, you find you're looking at a bison. And he's overlying another figure with a prominent pubic triangle, a female figure. And if we get closer, step back, you can see that the female figure is human, but very strange because she's headless. But her right arm over here is transforming into the head of a lion, like these lions down here. So it's bison man and lion woman. And lion woman is caught in the moment of transformation from a human into a lion. So that seems to be what is captured here. And you have to ask yourself, what experiences could have led our ancestors to create imagery like this? You don't see a woman turning into a lion in everyday life. What was the inspiration for this? From Germany, a carving about the height of my knee out of mammoth ivory of a lion man from Hollenstein Stadel Cave in Germany. And more figures. This one is called the Sorcerer from Trois Frères Cave, combination of wolf, owl, stag, human being, strange mixtures of hybrid creatures. These owls are from Lascaux Cave, and there is something curiously humanoid about the appearance of the heads. This is the oldest rock art from southern Africa. Again, it shows a therianthrope. The front half is some kind of huge feline. This is Apollo 11 cave in Namibia. It's 27,000 years old. But the hind legs are human. And this amazing image from the Drakensberg in South Africa. The bodies are human. The heads are those of antelopes, of elands, as a matter of fact. So these are eland men. This one has two feathers seeming to grow out of his back, and this one around his body is wrapped two serpents. That's what this lumpy effect around the body is, but the serpents also have the heads of elands. So eland-headed man with eland-headed serpents wrapped around his body. Please don't tell me that this was observed in daily life. This is an extraordinary visionary image which we're looking at here. Same in this image. We see human beings in the process of transformation into antelopes. They're caught as frozen in the moment of transformation, and they're perched on this curious zigzag line. Faces too. Well, this one's suggesting, is this the first portrait in history? Actually, not quite. There are some older, but curious characteristics of this face. The pointed chin, the high brow, just a hint of an eye there. And here, from South Africa, this curious figure, again, that high domed forehead, narrow pointed chin, rather sort of sinister tongue here coming out of the mouth. And here, from far away, Peshmerl Cave in France, I hope it's possible to see the lower part of the image. There's a humanoid figure in the lower part of the image, and above it, something in the sky. And I'll show you what that figure is as we get to the next image. Because if you redraw that humanoid figure, what you get is a figure very like the figures that we speak of as aliens or greys in popular culture today, except that this image, which we would immediately recognize as a grey today, is more than 20,000 years old. It's also pierced with something, and it's very interesting when you look at other rock art around the world that you again find figures pierced. And I just want to remind ourselves of the phenomenon of so-called alien surgery on UFO abductees and their sense of being pierced and invaded and sometimes having objects put in their bodies. Here from South Africa, this is a redrawing of one of the figures there, a boat, but it's in the sky. There's birds in the image, and there's something underneath it, and there's those curious zigzag lines. And these are both from caves in France. The archaeologists don't know what they represent. What are these curious things? What happened when the cave art began is referred to as the symbolic revolution. It's the time that we become fully human. It's as though we've been taught something that has sparked out our latent faculties. Is it possible that this sparking of humanity's faculties came to us from beyond as a gift? And if it came to us from beyond, what is this beyond? As I said at the beginning, I don't think it's as simple as a nuts and bolts explanation that some advanced alien technology developed on a planet going around another star led aliens here in crossing interstellar space to teach us these lessons and to continue teaching us these lessons and continue visiting us for 35,000 years. I think the problem is more complicated than that. And the insight into this problem, I think, actually can come to us from cave art. And I want to draw attention to the work of Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. I'm not going to go in detail into his arguments here, which have much to do with the patterns that are found in cave art and with those grids and other geometric forms. But over 20 years of battling the academic establishment, David's theory has now come to be accepted by the mainstream. It is regarded as the best explanation of cave art. And that explanation, he calls it the neuropsychological theory of cave art, is that the ancient artists were shamans, the kind of people that we would call shamans today. And they were, like all shamans everywhere, entering a deeply altered state of consciousness to make contact with the realm beyond. And when they returned to a normal state of consciousness, they would depict on the cave walls what they had seen in their visions. And this explains the strange and very distinctive characteristics of rock and cave art, which are found all around the world. All the same ingredients are always found in place. So we need to look at shamanism. Unfortunately, there are cultures still in the world today who are truly shamanistic, and see what they're involved in. And in every case, it involves altered states of consciousness. In some cases, those altered states might be brought about by austerities, by suffering terrible privations, by going on a quest and reducing oneself to an almost desperate state, freezing, hungry, isolated, alone. These are the kind of conditions that cut us off from the everyday world and allow us to gain contact with whatever is beyond. Sometimes an illness may be involved in the shamanistic calling. Sometimes it runs in families. And the word shaman, it's derived from Tungus Mongol, meaning one who knows. And what happened was that word entered European languages because European travelers visiting other parts of the world, not the Tungus Mongol, found similar ritual functionaries who were entering altered states of consciousness in just about every culture all around the world and called them shamans. And the purpose of these journeys, discovery of the future, curing the sick, transporting souls back and forth from the underworld, managing them there, sacrifice to spirits. And Weston Labare points out that certain plants are used by certain shamanistic cultures to enter these altered states of consciousness. We're looking at Amanita muscaria here, the hallucinogenic fly agaric mushroom. And it's not an accident, by the way, that the colors of Father Christmas are red and white. Because if you go back to the Siberian background of this, you find that after consuming the fly agaric mushroom, the shaman frequently experiences leaving through the chimney hole in the roof and returning through the same chimney hole and making a journey in the sky on a sleigh drawn by reindeer, which are flying through the heavens. Well, this is where this idea came from. Another one of the visionary plants, of course, is peyote. The active ingredient is mescaline. It's used by the Huichol in Mexico and other Native American groups for inducing altered states of consciousness. And I'll just take this opportunity to say, although I'm going to have quite a bit to say about visionary plants here, I don't want to make any judgments. I don't want to make any judgments about shamanistic cultures either. Shamanistic cultures find different ways to get into altered states of consciousness. The human creature can get out of the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness that we all embrace in the modern world by a variety of different techniques, and one of those techniques is visionary plants. Some people feel that using visionary plants is a kind of a failure or even a moral error, but I don't agree with that view. I think that whatever works effectively in a suitably respectful and responsible setting to produce an altered state of consciousness can be very valuable to us, and I won't judge one as better or worse than the others. The rain dance, the sun dance of the Native Americans involved pain to induce altered states of consciousness. The trance dance of the Kalahari Bushmen, they'll dance for 24 hours around a fire until they sense their spirits leaving their bodies and traveling into the beyond where they encounter spirits. This is brought about by dehydration and by the physical effort of the dance. It creates the necessary changes in the brain. Back to the visionary plants, mushrooms. Everybody's heard of magic mushrooms now, but if you go back to 1951, nobody in the West had heard of magic mushrooms. It was an American researcher, Gordon Wasson, who found a mushroom cult in Mexico and wrote about it in Life magazine. And it's really since then that there's been this interest in psychedelic mushrooms in the West, although I believe that interest was here in earlier times. In Central Africa, they use iboga, the plant that enables men to see the dead. It's a root bark, which is pounded and then consumed. I've taken ibogaine, and I won't be taking it again, I must tell you. It was 48 hours of absolute physical hell. I felt like I'd been broken completely apart and gradually and painfully reassembled. But I did have encounters with ancestors, and I did have profound visionary experiences, which made it an extremely intriguing lesson for me. In Central Africa, the use of ibogaine is systematized into a religion called the Bwiti. In fact, the president of Gabon is a member of the Bwiti. Here I am in the Amazon, picking the leaves from a bush that they call chacruna in the Amazon. The botanical name is Psychotria viridis, and the leaves of this bush contain high concentrations of pure dimethyltryptamine, that's DMT, which of course is a Schedule I Class A drug in the West and highly illegal. I have to tell you that you're all illegal in this room, by the way, because DMT is produced in the pineal gland. We all have it in our bodies in subpsychedelic concentrations. It's a natural brain hormone. It's found in this plant. There's an enzyme in the stomach that stops you metabolizing DMT. If you could drink 100 gallons of tea prepared from these leaves, and all it would do is give you a full stomach. You wouldn't have any visionary effects at all, because monoamine oxidase in the stomach switches off dimethyltryptamine and stops it working. So how do the Amazonian Indians derive a psychedelic brew from these leaves? they mix it with this vine. This is called the ayahuasca vine. Ayahuasca means the vine of souls, or the vine of the dead. And the vine contains a chemical that switches off monoamine oxidase in the stomach. It's called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Switches it off and allows the DMT in the leaves to become active and produces a journey that typically lasts for about 4 hours. Now, drinking, that's the mixture of the leaves and the vine, and you can see the vine being smashed up here by the shaman, put into a cooking pot. Layers of leaves are put on top of it, water's poured in, more vine is put, the whole thing's cooked for about 8 to 10 hours till it reduces to a sort of sticky consistency in the bottom of the pot. And you'll end up with a liter or two of a very dark, foul liquid, which I compare in taste to a mixture of raw sewage, old socks, battery acid, some sulfur, and just a hint of chocolate. I've drunk ayahuasca close to 35 times now, but even speaking about it and thinking about it, I kind of shudder. Because it truly is, it's a formidable taste. It's not just a bad taste, it's formidable. You know the moment you drink it that you're dealing with something extremely serious, very serious business. And that's another caution I'd like to add to anybody who's interested in the visionary plants and psychedelics. We use psychedelics completely wrongly in our society. Psychedelics are not about recreation. That's the last thing they should be about. They're about serious, in-depth personal exploration. And they're about a journey, and any journey can involve a risk. That risk can be reduced by a responsible, shamanic, ceremonial setting in which these plants are consumed. And that's why you don't get the catastrophes in the Amazon that you do get here in the West with people taking psychedelics in unprepared settings. Our society does not provide a context in which we can explore and experience these plants. Once you've got, what happens with ayahuasca, sorry, I'm going to be a bit physical here, but what happens with ayahuasca once you've drunk it is that you get very nauseous, and within about an hour, you also start to get diarrhea. So, you have to go jump behind a tree. It's very difficult for Westerners to adapt to this, the physical side of this. And I found it incredibly difficult, actually, but nevertheless went through it. And the first lesson ayahuasca taught me was actually your body doesn't matter. That's the least important part of you. It's your consciousness that matters. That's what matters. And what is happening at the level of consciousness is entry into an enchanted universe where you do indeed meet teachers. This is what they call ayahuasca in the Amazon. They call her a plant teacher. She teaches lessons. She's a school. Working with ayahuasca is a long process where you come to learn about yourself and your place in the world. And if you've behaved wickedly or unpleasantly to others, believe me, you'll be shown that in ayahuasca and given the opportunity to change it. Serpents are very commonly seen in ayahuasca visions. And the spirit of ayahuasca herself is often witnessed as a serpent, but sometimes as a human. Again, you will find these therianthropic figures, part animal, part human, like these felines with human heads and all these incredible serpents, very, very common in ayahuasca visions, and a sense of a connection with the wider universe that surrounds us. Our boundaries, our barriers to surrounding reality are lowered under the influence of ayahuasca. Now, these are the paintings of Pablo Amaringo, an Amazonian ayahuasca shaman, unfortunately recently deceased. Again, you can see the typical therianthropes, part animal, part human in these, and you can also see flying saucers up in these images. In fact, flying saucers and beings that we would recognize as extraterrestrials are very common in Pablo's paintings. This is a shaman working in the heart of the Amazon, painting depictions of flying saucers that he's seen in a visionary state. And if we go back to those strange images from the European caves, I think that they were inspired by the same visions that inspired Pablo. under the influence of ayahuasca. Probably in Europe they were using mushrooms. It's a curious thing that many of the experiences that shamans report with spirits, the entities that they call spirits, are incredibly similar to the experiences reported by UFO abductees in the West. I mean, when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's really quite surprising. And we do know a lot about the experiences of UFO abductees in the West, thanks to the work principally of John Mack, who was professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. They tried to take his job away once he began to take UFO abductees seriously. He listened to what they had to say. He didn't immediately conclude that they were mad. On the contrary, he concluded they were sane, but that they were having extraordinary and troubling experiences. And as a result, he recorded in detail the experiences of hundreds and hundreds of abductees, and so have the other researchers on this page. So let's just look at some of these similarities. When shamans encounter spirits, they usually first appear in the form of animals or birds or fish or therianthropes. And it's exactly the same with UFO abductions. Very often, the abducting being will first be seen in an animal form. There's an example there where the being appears as a gray deer or a wolf standing on the abductee's bed. And John Mack summed this up. The aliens appear to be consummate shapeshifters, often appearing initially to the abductees as animals, owls, very common, eagles, raccoons, and so on. So we have this concept of the spirit animal in shamanism. Shamans also report being floated up into the sky or sometimes climbing up a rope of light. The Bushmen in South Africa speak of this particularly, a sense of a thread of light coming down, and all you need to do is just touch it, and you're drawn up into the heavens. Again, these kind of experiences, both the sense of being floated up into the sky, sometimes through the roof, and the sense of following a thread of light into the sky, are also reported again and again by UFO abductees in the West in their interviews with John Mack at Harvard University. Shamans are not only abducted to the sky, they also very frequently abducted into caves or into underwater locations by the entities that they construe as spirits. And again, UFO abductees, you can read it for yourselves, have repeatedly reported the same experiences of being abducted to some underwater or cavernous location. And then, of course, there's the shamanic ordeal, which is really the essence of shamanism, the sense of your body being torn apart, broken apart, pierced with sharp knives. Surgery is conducted on the body. Sometimes all the bones are counted. Very, very strange things. And shamans again and again report objects being inserted into their bodies. Sometimes a crystal may be inserted into the brain or into the arm. And this, of course, again, is astonishingly similar to the reports of UFO abductees who go again and again, these puzzling descriptions of surgery, of painful procedures being conducted, of implants being put into their bodies. Absolutely identical to the experiences being described by shamans. Shamans have relationships in the spirit world. I know an Amazonian shaman whose wife has left him because of his partner in the spirit world. He's having children with her over there, and his wife in this world is not happy about it. Happens again and again. And exactly the same thing happens to UFO abductees. They reports of sex with the aliens who abduct them, of babies being born in the alien realm, of the abductee being repeatedly re-abducted to cuddle and nourish that baby. Very, very extraordinary similarities with shamanism and the sense of mission. Maria Sabina was given a book, and she was illiterate, but she could read. She learned everything from that book, millions and millions of things. It's very, very similar accounts, again, from UFO abductees who are given a book. They learn from it, but they're not allowed to bring the book back. But they do come back with a sense of mission, that they need to help humanity in some way, that they have healing powers. And now we'll jump over to fairies and elves. Why do they have so much in common with the things we call aliens and the entities we call spirits? The great work on this was Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, published in 1969. And what I did in Supernatural was I took all the evidence and data post-1969 and added it to the tremendous body of work that Jacques Vallée had already done. And it's true, really quite astonishing. Fairies, just like spirits, just like aliens, renowned for abducting people. You didn't want to get close to that fairy dance where they're dancing in a circle. Just touch it, you'll be drawn into it. You might come back, you'll think it's tomorrow. You might find 300 years have passed. This is very common in the fairy abduction stories. And a little bit like the issue of missing time in modern alien abduction stories. Sometimes fairies were cruel, sometimes they were kind. They too gave healing powers. They could fly. They had aerial vehicles which were construed as flying boats, flying castles, flying carriages. Today, we construe them in a different way. Sometimes the fairy abduction would involve going underground or into a cave. And here, both of these images depict that kind of abduction. Here we can see the fairy dance. There's the entrance into the hollow hills behind. And in the foreground, a psychedelic mushroom, Amanita muscaria. And here, the fairy world, they're calling this gentleman in, and probably some of you can't see it, but down at the bottom again, there are mushrooms in the image. So again, a similarity with alien abductions and with the spirits encountered by shamans. Fairies and elves often appear as animals or as part animal, part human hybrids. I have this woodcut at home. It's from Holland in the 15th century, and it shows a group of fairies dancing in a circle. And you can see that they're transformed. They're part human and part animal in form. A very common image in shamanism as well. Here's Melusine, a feared medieval fairy, part serpent, part human, and feared for abducting human babies. We have the story of changelings and of hybrid alien human children, of women being abducted to nurse these children. Both are common in the domain of alien abductions and of fairies and elves. So these are some of the common forms in which aliens and spirits and fairies all appear. We human beings, we can't see something without interpreting it. Interpretation is built into perception from the get-go. There's no such thing as a neutral perception. All perception is interpreted according to our framework. And I think that what we're doing here is we're looking at the same phenomenon interpreted in different cultural ways from different references. We call them aliens. Shamans call them spirits. In medieval Europe, they were called fairies and elves. These four images all have great similarities, these lines and patterns. Three of them are from the walls of the painted caves in southern France, and one was painted by one of John Mack's UFO abductees in 1990. And she said that just before she was abducted, this image was thrown into her visual field. I think that the inspiration behind all the images was the same. This is the modern one. These are the 20,000-year-old ones. So what I'm suggesting is that such experiences become accessible as much through alterations in our state of consciousness as through any physical investigations in the material realm. And actually, there was some very interesting research done in the 50s and 60s with hallucinogenic drugs, LSD, DMT, mescaline, psilocybin, also with other techniques for getting volunteers into altered states. And typically there's a process, there's a stage where you first see patterns, those grids and zigzag lines, and then they begin to take shape. You have a sense of passing through a vortex, and then you enter a seamlessly convincing parallel world. And here the modern volunteer painted the being that he encountered in that parallel world, and lo and behold, it's another therianthrope. It's a man with the head of a fox wearing a business suit. as I say, interpretation is built into perception at the outset, and that's true whether the perceptions are visions or whether they are everyday perceptions. This man's work cannot be avoided if you want to explore these possibilities, and he's Dr. Rick Strassman. He's a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico, professor of psychiatry there, and he did the first detailed scientific work with dimethyltryptamine in the 1990s. For about 8 years, he conducted a long series of trials with full DEA approval of volunteers, giving them DMT in a hospital setting. And after a while, Rick actually had to give this work up because it was just blowing his own mind too much what his volunteers were doing. Because without comparing notes and without knowing the experiences that the others were having, they were all having the same experiences. It was as though they were all entering the same other reality and meeting the same beings there who did very familiar things, surgical operations, inserted objects into their bodies, a sense of, you know, journeying into outer space, into an alien laboratory, insect-like creatures, another thing that's very commonly reported by UFO abductees, more probes and insertions, the sense of going out into deep space. And this volunteer said, I always knew we weren't alone. I thought that the only way to encounter them was with bright lights and flying saucers in outer space. It never occurred to me to actually encounter them in my own inner space. Rick Strassman was very baffled by the consistencies that his volunteers were reporting. And he observed that there were astonishing similarities with the reports given by UFO abductees. Although in the case of Rick's volunteers, they definitely weren't being abducted because they were right there on a hospital bed in front of him. But something was happening at the level of consciousness that was being experienced as an abduction. Now, we could argue that that was because this was happening in the 1990s, and those volunteers had all read the alien abduction stuff and the National Enquirer, and you know, they'd seen the various programs on TV, and they simply regurgitated that. But actually, if you go back to the early 1950s, the first UFO abduction report to enter the public domain was in 1961. If you go back to the early 1950s, you'll find other scientists who did work with DMT and human volunteers. And they, again, reported exactly the same kind of alien abduction experiences before any of these had entered the public domain. So they couldn't have been influenced by that. And it's almost like the culture is being influenced by these experiences rather than the other way around. So it's very important to note here that what Rick is saying is not that these experiences are simply an artifact of DMT. He is suggesting that we need to view the brain not as a generator of consciousness, but as a receiver of consciousness, and that certain techniques, including the visionary plants, can retune the receiver wavelength of the brain and allow us to gain access to a much wider reality than is normally available to us. And this raises the question, what is reality? It involves us as well as all that out there, whatever that is. William Blake put forward the idea of the doors of perception. If the doors of perception could only be cleansed, then we would see everything as it really is. So he's suggesting that our senses are shut down in some way by our society and by our condition as humans, and that if we could just clean the windows and clean the doors, we could see what was going on. William James, back at the turn of the 19th century, experimented with nitrous oxide, had extraordinary experiences, and he made the point that no account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness completely disregarded. They forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. And Aldous Huxley, of course, took this much further, and his suggestion is that one of the main functions of the brain is actually as a reducing valve to cut a lot of reality out. Otherwise, we just would be swamped. We have to filter out a whole lot of reality in order to function in what he refers to here. Through these, he refers to them as permanent or temporary bypasses. There flows something more than, and above all, something different from, the carefully selected utilitarian material which our narrowed individual minds regard as a complete or at least sufficient picture of reality. He's suggesting that what these visionary plants do is they loosen off the reducing valve and allow more of reality in. And Albert Hofmann made exactly the same point, that these substances may be shifting the wavelength setting of the brain. As Strassman says, we're, most of us, most of the time, tuned into channel normal, like a TV set. But there are other channels broadcasting, and if we wish to tune into them, we have to adjust our state of consciousness. And to cut a long story short, Strassman's suggestion with UFO abductees is that this is an experience that is happening entirely at the level of consciousness. And he's suggesting that there are people who overproduce DMT in the brain. That we all have DMT in our bodies, as I said. But the UFO abductees may be natural visionaries who overproduce DMT, puts them into a trance state in which they have these experiences. But it's, again, vitally important to emphasize that Strassman is not saying that therefore means these experiences are unreal. Quite the opposite. He is saying, in his opinion, these experiences are real. That what's happening is the adjustment of the receiver wavelength of the brain is allowing us to tune into them, because there's nothing in science that allows us to reduce so-called hallucinations simply to the altered electrochemistry of the brain that accompanies them. And the example that I give to try to put this across is the example of the telescope. If we want to look at a very distant star with our little telescope, we're going to have to tune it in. We're going to have to focus it. And as we focus it, physical changes will take place in the relationship between the lenses inside the barrel of the telescope, obviously. And eventually, we will see the star. We'd be completely wrong to say that the star is the physical changes inside the barrel of the telescope. No. Those simply allowed us to see it. And that's the suggestion with the visionary plants as well. Yes, they do induce changes in the brain, but the experiences that result are not the changes in the brain. That's simply what allows us to let those experiences in. So, in conclusion to all this, I think that targeted investigations of alien contacts through induced altered states of consciousness would be a very useful addition to the investigative tools of the whole UFO phenomenon. I think we need to coordinate Western UFO sightings with the experiences of shamans. And most important of all, I think we have to listen much more closely to what shamans have to say about our connections as humans with the realms and intelligences that lie beyond this material world. Thank you. When I talked to shamans in the Amazon about this, I found that they were all in a deep sense of sadness about what is happening in the world. And they see the chaos and horror that is spreading as originating in Western technological society. And they believe this is happening because Western technological society has severed its connection with spirit. We have just cut it. And this is a very, very, very dangerous situation for us to find ourselves in. One of the mistakes we make is to demonize and persecute altered states of consciousness. The prehistoric record of the cave paintings shows that the single most significant leap forward in the entire human story occurred in connection with altered states of consciousness, with those paintings on the cave walls. It is, in my view, and I will make a political statement here. I'm not here to advocate any plants or any substances, but I will make a political statement. If I am not sovereign over my own consciousness as an adult, then I'm not sovereign over anything. And I might as well forget about talking about freedom. Our Western societies go preaching freedom to countries all over the world. In fact, we're so keen on freedom, we'll impose it on them. But what kind of freedom is it really? Thank you. Thank you. What kind of freedom is it when we live in a society that rigidly patrols the consciousness of adults? First of all, by swamping us with the narcotic of television, of reality TV, day in, day out, 24 hours a day, flooding into the brains of our children, almost unstoppable. I believe sending us to sleep, depriving us of the ability to make informed choice. And secondly, threatening us with years, decades in prison for exploring our consciousness with the shamanistic plants that have been in use in human cultures for tens of thousands of years. It's just obvious to me that something is seriously wrong with a society that does that. And if we're going to heal this planet, we've got to re-establish contact with spirit. And we will never re-establish contact with spirit unless we assert sovereignty over our own consciousness, first and foremost. You know? That should be a closed door to government and the state, this space inside our heads. And it's never been more urgent. My God, look what's happening to the Amazon now. You know, it actually ran dry in 2005. Look at this incredible destruction of the rainforest. What kind of suicidal impulse is leading us down this course? To cut down the majestic old-growth rainforest of the Amazon and replace it with soybean farms. I mean, are we actually insane? What is going on here? It makes you believe in a demonic force that is working against the interests of humanity. Because, you know, 6 months of the world's military expenditure could solve the problem of the Amazon forever. Forever. It's just so easy to do, but we don't make that choice. We'd rather spend it on destruction and destructive technology than actually paying the people of the Amazon to garden that incredible resource of our planet. That's what should be done. It's poverty that leads people to cut down the rainforest. Well, we could solve that problem very easily. This is a resource of the whole world, and it needs to be cared for, but we're so dislocated from spirit that we just see it as an economic resource. We can't see it as a huge spiritual reservoir of power, which is exactly what it is. We have to re-enter the enchanted universe if we want to go forward in any universe, frankly. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Graham Hancock, for inspiring us all, for coming here.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. I last spoke here 2 years ago, I think, and there's always a wonderful atmosphere and energy here. I'm going to be talking on, the reason I'm showing these 2 books is the subject that I'm going to be talking about, the factual basis of it is in my book Supernatural, and if you want more factual detail on some of the things I'm going to say, it'll be in there. I've also just published my first novel after years of writing non-fiction, and that's Entangled, and it also concerns parallel realms and altered states of consciousness, so that's why I'm putting them both up there. When we talk about crop circles, and this talk is not about crop circles, but when we talk about them, I've noticed that a lot of people are interested in exploring the possibility that aliens or extraterrestrials may be involved in the making of these crop circles. I'd prefer not to jump immediately to that conclusion, but my own sense is that we are dealing with something from the beyond when we deal with crop circles. Some sort of communication from the beyond, not from this daily realm of life. And I think the question of what that beyond is ago. And that tool type, which is called the Oldowan stone tool tradition, actually continued without change for the best part of 1 million years. That's an incredibly long time if you think that the whole story of human civilization is 5,000 years long. 1 million years they stuck with the same stone tools. And then there was a change. These are also Oldowan. Then there was a change and the Acheulean stone tool tradition came in. And that goes from about 1.5 million years ago right down to 250,000 years ago, getting pretty recent. So that tells us that a tradition was being passed down, but it also tells us that our ancestors at that time were incredibly rigid and had become fixed in a particular framework and just kept churning out the same sort of artifacts again and again and again and again and again for hundreds of thousands of years. And so if you look at the story of human evolution, it's a roughly 6 million year story from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee up to us today, and quite frankly, it's 6 million years of almost total boredom. Nothing really happens. They just make these incredibly dull tools, and they keep on making them. And they slowly, slowly, slowly start to look more and more like us. The first sign that something extraordinary is beginning to happen comes in around about 100,000 years ago, 100 to 125,000 years ago, where we start seeing definite evidence that our ancestors are making some kind of personal ornaments, spirituality. It's not just the paintings on the walls. Everything conspires to draw you into this underworld and to speak to you of realities beyond our own. One of the great myths is that the cave artists were simply painting animals that they hunted. Not so. There's no correlation at all between the animals that were hunted around particular caves and the animals that are painted there. And often, if you get close to some of these paintings, you find that the animals are very strange, like this deer here with these extraordinary antlers, which you do not find in everyday life. And often they have curious little geometrical patterns in the design as well. Like, for example, here in Lascaux, two beautiful running horses, an incredible work of art. But what's this little grid doing up here as part of the image? And here, it's like the cow jumped over the moon, and there's the grid again. What is that? What was that for? Nobody really seemed to know until quite recently. Flows and patterns of dots around the animals in the imagery. And hands everywhere. One of the things that I found most eerie about the painted caves, when you go into them, is these handprints that are on the walls. Now, they were often created by placing the hand against the wall and then actually blowing paint, spitting it over the hand and leaving a negative imprint. But as you go in and shell beads, shells that are drilled in a certain way, definitely were hung in necklaces. It's a symbolism. It's the first sign of symbolism. Then if you go to Blombos Cave in South Africa, you'll find the first real graphic art. This is the first thing that you can really call art, where these geometric patterns have been incised into the side of a small block of stone. But if you jump forward to 50,000 years ago or less, and particularly the period between 40 and 30,000 years ago, it's as though a light has been switched on in the human brain all around the world. Something incredible has happened. We are, by this stage, of course, dealing with fully anatomically modern human beings. But we had been dealing with fully anatomically modern human beings for 200,000 years before that. But they weren't doing this stuff. They weren't creating this extraordinary art. And it's really a great mystery where the inspiration for cave art came from and where the ability to create that art was developed. It seems to switch on really quite suddenly. Now, I've been lucky enough to visit about 20 of the great painted caves in southern Europe. And these places are cathedrals of the spirit. You enter an underground realm and find yourself surrounded by the most incredible expression of human and remains to be settled. It might be aliens in the nuts and bolts sense crossing interstellar space in incredible spaceships to get here, or it might be something even more mysterious than that, but certainly something not of this not of this realm. Now, we're very close to the great African apes. In fact, that's what we are. We're just another great African ape, and the DNA difference between us and them is extremely small. And yet there obviously is a huge difference, and we assume that if there is an interest in this world from the beyond, it's somehow an interest in us. When we look at the human story and we trace the evolution of humanity, we find that the focus to a large extent is on changes in physical appearance, that we were stooped and sort of knuckle dragging, and we became more upright, our appearance became more and more modern, our brow ridges receded, we became taller. The talk tends to be about these physical changes that take place over the evolutionary story of mankind. What's also interesting and talked about a lot is the question of tools. Our ancestors didn't make any tools at all until 2.5 million years ago. They weren't anatomically modern humans then. They didn't look like you and I. But they started making the first tools about 2.5 million years